Margaret Calloway stood in the overgrown driveway of 9 Cypress Creek Lane and felt something she hadn't felt in years. The particular bone-deep cold of a woman who has nothing left to lose. She was 63 years old, recently retired, recently widowed in spirit if not in law, and holding a single rusted key that her dead sister had left her in a will that had made an entire family laugh out loud in a lawyer's office. Behind her, the Georgia wind moved through the tall grass, like a whisper she couldn't quite make out. Ahead of her stood the forgotten carriage house, sagging shutters, cracked window panes, a porch that tilted like it was trying to bow out of existence. And all around her, the quiet, suffocating weight of a secret that had been buried for 40 years.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Calloway was born the oldest of 2 daughters in a modest household in Fairbelle, Georgia. Story continues through the full backstory of Maggie, Eleanor, Raymond, Frank's passing, and the will reading. Her brother-in-law, Raymond Whitfield, had laughed the loudest. "Maggie gets the shack," he'd said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, adjusting his silk pocket square like a man who had already won. And maybe he had. He'd walked away with the family home, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, and the land, everything her sister Eleanor had built over a lifetime. Maggie had walked away with a condemned carriage house on a forgotten back road, a property that hadn't had running water since 1989, and the confused, pitying stares of a town that had watched her family story play out like a slow-motion disaster for decades. What no one in that lawyer's office understood, what Raymond Whitfield, with all his confidence and all his lawyers, could never have predicted, was what Eleanor had actually hidden inside that carriage house. Not furniture, not old clothes, not the worthless junk of a lifelong past. What Eleanor Calloway Whitfield had hidden in the walls of 9 Cypress Creek Lane was the truth. The whole devastating, legally explosive truth about where the Whitfield family fortune had actually come from. A truth she had spent 40 years too frightened to speak aloud. Truth she had finally decided to leave for the one person she trusted completely, her older sister. And that truth was about to change everything. If you have ever been handed the broken piece, the leftover, the thing nobody wanted, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what Margaret Calloway found inside the crumbling walls of that forgotten carriage house will prove to you that the people who laugh first don't always laugh last, that sometimes the ones we've lost leave us more than we know, and that a secret kept for 40 years, when it finally comes to light, carries more power than anyone standing in that lawyer's office could have imagined. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age, and this is Maggie's story. The carriage house at 9 Cypress Creek Lane had not always been forgotten. Maggie remembered it from childhood, vaguely, the way you remember things that existed on the edge of your attention before you were old enough to find them interesting. It had belonged to the Whitfield family long before Eleanor married into it. Raymond's father, a hard-edged man named Burke Whitfield, had built it in the early 1960s on a parcel of land that sat behind the main Whitfield property, separated by a stretch of old magnolia trees and a creek that ran fast in spring and nearly dry by August. Burke had used it to house extended family during the summers, cousins and uncles who came down from Atlanta, business associates who needed a place to stay while deals were being negotiated. It had been, by all accounts, a neat and well-kept little structure back then. 2 bedrooms, a small, modest sitting room, a kitchen with blue and white tiles that people apparently remarked on, a covered porch facing the creek. By the time Eleanor married Raymond in the late 1980s, the carriage house had already begun its slow decline. Burke Whitfield was aging and uninterested in maintaining a property nobody used anymore. The cousins had stopped coming. The business associates had found hotels. The blue and white kitchen tiles had cracked and been patched with mismatched grout. Raymond had inherited the property along with everything else when Burke died in 1993, and had promptly done nothing with it, which was, Maggie had always thought, very much in keeping with Raymond's particular brand of neglect, the kind that dressed itself up as practicality. For years, the carriage house had simply sat there behind the magnolia trees, getting quieter and smaller as the vegetation crept up around it. Eleanor had mentioned it occasionally over the decades, usually in passing, usually with an expression that Maggie had never been able to fully read. She was going to fix it up one day, she'd say sometimes, or I keep meaning to go through what's left in there. But she never did. And Maggie, wrapped up in her own life, in Frank, in nursing, in the ordinary, beautiful fullness of her days, had never thought to ask why. It was only now, standing in Eleanor's absence, that Maggie began to understand that her sister's relationship with that carriage house had never been casual, that the way Eleanor avoided it and mentioned it in the same breath had not been the distracted carelessness of a busy woman. It had been the careful, practiced behavior of someone keeping a very specific distance from something she was not ready to face. And in the end, rather than face it herself,
Eleanor had done what she always did when something felt too large and too frightening for her alone. She had passed it to Maggie. Maggie had spent the first week after the will reading doing nothing about it. She had gone home to her quiet house, watered her plants, eaten soup she didn't taste, and let herself grieve her sister in the wordless way she had learned to grieve since Frank, just sitting with it, not trying to make it smaller or neater than it was. Grief, in Maggie's experience, was not something you processed. It was something you absorbed slowly over time, the way old wood absorbs weather. You just let it happen and trusted that you would still be standing when it was done. But the key sat on her kitchen table the entire week. She couldn't put it in a drawer. Every time she tried, something stopped her. The key was the last thing Eleanor had chosen to give her. Putting it in a drawer felt like putting her sister in a drawer, and she wasn't ready for that. On the 8th day, Maggie put the key in her coat pocket, got in her car, and drove to Cypress Creek Lane. The driveway was barely visible from the road. Weeds had swallowed the gravel almost completely, and the old gate that Burke Whitfield had hung at the entrance had long since rusted off its hinges and lay flat in the tall grass, like a fallen soldier. Maggie parked at the road and walked in, her sensible shoes finding uncertain ground beneath the overgrowth. The magnolia trees were enormous now, their roots buckling the remnants of the path, their branches so thick overhead that even in November, when they were heavy and still, they gave the impression of a tunnel. And then the carriage house came into view, and Maggie stopped walking. She had not seen it up close in at least 30 years, maybe more. What she saw now was the ruin of something that had once had dignity. The porch sagged so severely on one end that the railing had snapped clean and lay in a heap below. The shutters on the 2 front windows hung at angles that suggested they were only still attached, out of stubbornness. The siding, which had once been painted a clean white, was grey and soft with rot, peeling away in strips that curled like old paper. The roof over the porch had partially collapsed, and a tree branch had pushed its way through the gap and simply stayed there, bare and unapologetic. The front yard was a tangle of dead honeysuckle vine and old field grass that came up past Maggie's knees. Somewhere, under all of it, she could just make out the ghost of a brick path that had once led from the gate to the porch steps. She stood there for a long time, just looking. The wind moved through the magnolia trees. A crow called from somewhere behind the house. The creek, she realized she could hear it faintly, still running even now, still there, even after everything. Margaret Calloway was 63 years old. She was a retired nurse. She had lost a husband and a sister, and had kept standing both times. She looked at the broken porch, the rotting walls, the collapsed roof, and she did something that surprised her. She laughed, not bitterly, not with despair, just the plain, clear laugh of a woman who recognized in the wreckage in front of her a challenge she was absolutely going to accept. She walked up to the front door, put the rusted key in the rusted lock, turned it, and the door opened. The smell hit her first. That particular combination of mildew, damp wood, and the ghost of something that had once been a home, old fabric, old dust, old life. Maggie stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior. The windows were so thick with grime that the November light barely made it through, casting the sitting room in a grey, underwater haze that made everything look like it was slowly dissolving. The room was not empty. That surprised her. She had expected bare floors and stripped walls, the hollow indifference of a space that had been cleared out. Instead, the sitting room was still furnished, or rather, still occupied by the ruins of furniture. A sofa against the far wall had surrendered its shape entirely, the cushions black with mould and collapsed inward like a mouth. A wooden side table still stood near the window, though one leg had given out, and it leaned at a defeated angle. On the floor, a braided rag rug, once colourful, now the uniform grey of everything else, had been eaten through at its centre by moisture and time. On the walls, rectangles of slightly less faded paint marked where pictures had once hung, their ghosts still visible in the pattern of the wallpaper. Maggie stepped inside carefully, testing each floorboard before she committed her weight. Nursing had given her a habit of assessing structural integrity, of bodies, of buildings, of situations before she moved through them. She had learned over 40 years that the thing that looked most stable was not always the thing that would hold. The floor, to her relief, was largely sound. Old heart pine boards, thick and stubborn, they had held up better than the walls around them. She moved through the sitting room into the narrow hallway beyond. To her left, a small bedroom with a rusted iron bed frame still standing in the centre, its mattress long gone, its springs exposed and oxidized. To her right, the kitchen. She pushed open the kitchen door and stood for a moment in what had once been the room with the blue and white tiles. Half of them were still there. The other half had fallen from the walls and lay on the counter and floor in irregular piles like broken teeth. The ones that remained were cloudy with mineral deposits and grime, but she could see the pattern beneath, a steady, stubborn blue and white that had not entirely given up. The kitchen window above the sink was intact, one of the few unbroken windows in the house, and through it Maggie could see the creek closer than she'd realized, moving through the trees not 30 yards from the back of the house. She stood there looking at the creek for a long moment. Then she heard the car. It came down Cypress Creek Lane slowly, the way cars move when their drivers are looking at something specific. Maggie walked back through the house and stepped out onto the sagging porch just in time to see Raymond Whitfield's black Range Rover stop at the end of the driveway. He didn't pull in. He sat with the engine running, window down, looking at the carriage house with an expression that Maggie could read clearly even from a distance. Not concern, not curiosity. Satisfaction. He had come to watch. She understood that immediately. He had heard, through whatever channels Raymond Whitfield used to monitor the lives of people he considered beneath him, that Maggie had come to look at her inheritance, and he had driven out to Cypress Creek Lane to see her face when she saw it, to confirm with his own eyes that she had nothing. Maggie stood on the broken porch and looked at him. She did not look away. She did not go back inside. She stood straight, The way she had stood in difficult rooms for 40 years, the rooms where you told families things they did not want to hear, the rooms where you had to be the steadiest person present, and she simply looked at him. Raymond leaned out the window. "Nice place," he called. His voice carried easily in the cold air. Eleanor always did have a sense of humor. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never once in his life been told that he was wrong about something important. "You can still sell it to me, you know. I'll give you 20,000 for it, more than it's worth. Consider it a kindness." Maggie looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, clearly and without heat, "I'll be in touch, Raymond." She turned and walked back inside the house. She heard his window go up. She heard the Range Rover reverse and drive away. She stood in the dim hallway of the carriage house and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had taught anxious patients to breathe when the world felt like it was closing in. She was not going to sell. She had known that before she'd even gotten out of the car, but it wasn't stubbornness that held her here. It wasn't pride. It was something she hadn't expected to feel the moment she'd stepped through the door. A pull. Something beneath the mold and the decay and the broken tiles. Some quality of this specific place that felt almost like a voice, like the house itself was trying to tell her that it mattered, that what was inside it mattered. She thought of Eleanor, of the way her sister had always spoken about this place, never directly, never with any real information, but always with that particular guarded expression. The expression Maggie now recognized, standing here in the grey light and the mildew smell, as someone who knows exactly what a place contains and has chosen for reasons of their own not to say so. There was something here. Maggie could feel it the way she'd once felt a patient's hidden pain before any test confirmed it. A clinical intuition, bone deep and certain. She pulled out her phone, turned on a flashlight, and began to look. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maggie started in the sitting room methodically, the way she had always approached a difficult task, not with urgency, but with patience. She moved the collapsed sofa away from the wall, dragging it inch by inch across the pine floor, checking behind it. Nothing but a dark rectangle of cleaner wall and a single rusted nail. She checked behind the leaning side table. She opened the door of a narrow closet near the hallway and found 3 wire hangers, a mouse nest long abandoned, and a smell that made her step back quickly. She moved to the bedroom next. The iron bed frame was bolted to the wall on one side, which she found strange. Most bed frames simply stood on their own legs. This one had a bracket drilled directly into the wall studs, as if whoever had placed it there wanted to make sure it never moved. She knelt on the floor and looked underneath. Dust. Old insulation that had crumbled down from somewhere above. A single button, pearl white, nothing else. She stood and looked at the bracket on the wall for a moment. Then she looked at the floor beneath the bed. The floorboards here were the same old pine as the rest of the house, but something was slightly different about the pattern. Near the wall where the bed frame's bracket was fixed, the boards ran in the expected direction. But in the corner, diagonally opposite, 2 boards ran perpendicular to the rest, a small section maybe 2 feet square that someone had laid differently. And then she realized as she crouched closer that someone had painted over and over and over, until the seam was nearly invisible under layers of old paint that had since cracked and yellowed. Maggie took the small pocket knife she kept on her keychain. 40 years as a nurse had taught her to always have something sharp within reach, and dragged the blade along the seam. The paint crumbled away in thin flakes. Beneath it, the gap between the boards was deliberate, clean-cut, not a settling crack or a construction irregularity. Someone had cut those boards on purpose, and then spent considerable effort making sure nobody would notice. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Her heart had picked up its pace in a way she recognized from certain moments in her nursing career. The specific alertness of a person who has just understood that what they're looking at is important, that the next few minutes are going to matter. She went to her car and came back with a flathead screwdriver from the small toolkit Frank had kept in the trunk, and that she had never removed because removing it would have felt like erasing him. She worked the blade into the seam, applied careful upward pressure, and a section of floor lifted. Not easily. It resisted the way things resist when they have been undisturbed for a very long time, but it lifted. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, roughly 2 feet square and about 8 inches deep. Not a full cellar or a room, just a hidden pocket, deliberately constructed, deliberately concealed. And inside were 3 things. The first was a large manila envelope sealed with wax that had dried to the color of old blood. The second was a small notebook with a cover of burgundy cloth, its spine intact, its pages swollen slightly with age but not destroyed. The third was a photograph, loose, face down, tucked under the notebook as if placed there last and pressed flat with intention. Maggie sat very still for a moment. The cold of the floor came up through her coat. The creak moved outside the kitchen window. A branch tapped once against the side of the house in the wind, and then went quiet. She picked up the photograph first, turned it over. It was a picture of Eleanor. Young Eleanor, maybe 22 or 23, which would have placed the photo in the mid-1980s, a year or two before she married Raymond. She was sitting at a table Maggie did not recognize, in a room Maggie did not recognize, and across the table from her sat a man who was not Raymond Whitfield. He was older than Eleanor by perhaps 15 years, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair going grey at the temples, and an expression on his face that Maggie could only describe as the expression of a man who is entirely, devastatingly in love. His hand rested on the table close to Eleanor's, not touching, but close enough that the intention was unmistakable. On the back of the photograph, in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, looping and generous, the handwriting of a woman who had been told as a girl that she took up too much space and had never once agreed, were 4 words: "Before I was afraid." Maggie set the photograph down carefully on the floorboard beside her. She opened the burgundy notebook. The first page read, "My name is Eleanor Calloway Whitfield, and I am writing this in 1988 because I need someone to know the truth, even if I am too frightened to say it aloud. If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage I spent my whole life looking for, or I have run out of time to find it. Either way, the truth is here. All of it. Read carefully. It matters more than you know." Maggie read for 2 hours without moving. By the time she finished, the light through the kitchen window had shifted from afternoon to the flat grey of early evening. And she understood 3 things with absolute and devastating clarity. She understood what her sister had known. She understood what her sister had been afraid of. And she understood, with the particular cold certainty of a woman who had spent 40 years reading situations before anyone else in a room could, exactly what Raymond Whitfield had done. Eleanor had met a man named Edmund Hartley in the spring of 1986. She was 23 years old, working as a bookkeeper for a small property management company in Fairbell, and Edmund was one of the company's clients. A quiet, methodical man in his late 30s who owned a modest but growing collection of rental properties across 3 counties. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who entered a room and rearranged it around himself the way Raymond Whitfield did. But he was steady, and he was kind. And according to Eleanor's notebook, he had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had spent years trying to formulate. They had been together for nearly a year. A quiet, careful relationship conducted mostly in private because Edmund was a private man, and Eleanor, still young and uncertain of herself, had not yet learned how to claim the things she wanted out loud. She had loved him. The notebook made that plain on every page in the particular way that people write about love when they're not performing it for anyone else, plainly, exactly, without ornament. Then Raymond Whitfield had arrived. Raymond had come to the property management company on business in the autumn of 1986. He was 36, established, the kind of man whose confidence filled a room so completely that it left less space for everyone else's doubts. He had noticed Eleanor immediately and had pursued her with the focused, systematic attention of a man accustomed to acquiring things he decided he wanted. He had been charming. He had been persistent. And Eleanor, 23 years old and not yet wise enough to understand the difference between a man who loved her and a man who wanted to own her, had been dazzled. She had ended things with Edmund quietly, painfully, in the way necessary endings always are. And she had married Raymond Whitfield 10 months later in a ceremony at the Fairbell Presbyterian Church that their mother had called the happiest day of her life. What Eleanor had not known when she married Raymond, what she did not discover until 3 years into a marriage, when she was already expecting her first child and already beginning to understand that the man she had married was not the man who had courted her, was what Raymond had done to Edmund Hartley. Edmund had owned 13 rental properties across Greer, Dalton, and Fairbell counties at the time of Raymond and Eleanor's wedding. By the end of 1989, he owned none of them. The notebook detailed it all page by careful page, cross-referenced with dates and document numbers that Eleanor had spent years quietly collecting. Raymond had used his seat on the county's zoning appeals board, a position he had obtained through connections and financial contributions that Eleanor's notebook documented with meticulous precision, to engineer a series of code reclassifications that had made Edmund's properties non-conforming overnight, unable to rent them legally under the new designations, unable to sell them at anything approaching their real value while the reclassifications were under dispute. Edmund had been slowly strangled financially until he had no choice but to sell every single property for fractions of what they were worth. And who had bought them? Through a series of holding companies and shell entities that had taken Eleanor years to trace, the answer was Raymond Whitfield. 13 properties acquired through manufactured regulatory ruin, the seed capital, the foundation, the actual origin of everything the Whitfield family real estate portfolio had become over the following 4 decades. All of it built on land that had been stolen from Edmund Hartley through deliberate, calculated corruption. And in the manila envelope sealed with its wax the colour of old blood, Eleanor had placed the proof, original zoning board minutes with Raymond's handwriting in the margins, correspondence between Raymond and 2 county officials that discussed the reclassifications in language that left no room for innocent interpretation. A private investigator's report from 1995. Eleanor had hired someone quietly, at considerable personal risk, that traced the shell companies back to Raymond with documentary precision, and a signed, notarized statement from Edmund Hartley himself, dated 1997, describing in full what had been done to him and confirming that he had never been able to pursue legal action because by the time he understood what had happened, Raymond Whitfield had enough influence in the county to make any local proceeding disappear before it began. Maggie sat on the cold floor of the carriage house bedroom with all of it spread around her, and felt the particular weight of a truth that had been kept too long in a small, dark space. She thought about her sister carrying this for 40 years. Learning it 3 years into a marriage she was already trapped in with a child already born, and another on the way in a town where Raymond Whitfield's name was on buildings and boards, and the lips of everyone who mattered. Understanding what her husband had done and calculating with the merciless clarity of someone who had no good options that there was no safe way to use what she knew. So, Eleanor had done what frightened people do with unbearable knowledge. She had hidden it. She had sealed it in wax and pressed it under the floorboards of the one place Raymond had never cared about and never visited, and she had lived with it quietly for the rest of her life, until the end, until she had finally done the only thing left that she could do. She had left the key to someone she trusted, someone steady, someone who had spent 40 years walking into difficult rooms and being the calmest person there. Maggie gathered everything carefully, placed it back in the envelope and the notebook, and sat for one more moment in the great evening light of 9 Cypress Creek Lane. And she took out her phone and called a lawyer. Sandra Okafor had practiced law in Fairbell for 19 years out of a 2-room office above a hardware store on Garrison Street, and she had seen most of what a small Georgia town could produce in the way of legal trouble. Disputed estates, neighbor feuds over property lines, business partners who had shaken hands on things they should have put in writing. She was 58 years old, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular patience that comes from spending nearly 2 decades watching powerful people assume they have already won. She was also, crucially, one of the few attorneys in Fairbell who had never taken a single dollar from Raymond Whitfield or any of his associated companies, which in a town of Fairbell's size was either a point of professional pride or an act of deliberate principle. In Sandra's case it was both. Maggie had known her distantly for years. They had served on the same hospital auxiliary board in the early 2000s. And Maggie had always noticed the way Sandra listened in meetings, completely without performing attention, without waiting for her own turn to speak. It was the quality Maggie most respected in a person, and most rarely found. When she needed a lawyer, Sandra was the only name she considered. She had called from the car, parked at the end of the Cypress Creek Lane driveway in the early dark, the envelope and the notebook on the passenger seat beside her. Sandra had answered on the 3rd ring, listened without interrupting for 4 minutes while Maggie described what she had found, and then said, simply and without drama, "Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning and bring everything." Maggie brought everything. Sandra spent 3 hours going through the documents while Maggie sat across the desk and drank the worst coffee she had ever tasted from a mug that said, "World's Okayest Lawyer," which Maggie suspected was not ironic. By the end of the 3 hours, Sandra had made 28 pages of handwritten notes, and her expression had moved through several distinct phases. Careful attention, then quiet surprise, then the focused stillness of someone who has understood that what is in front of them is serious. "This is real," Sandra said finally, setting down her pen. She did not say it with excitement. She said it the way doctors say a diagnosis, factually, with the full weight of what it means included in the tone. The zoning board documentation alone is significant, but the investigators' report tracing the shell companies and Edmund Hartley's notarized statement, that changes this from a historical grievance into an active legal matter. Do you know if Edmund Hartley is still alive? Maggie didn't know. She had never met him. He had existed in her life only as a name in her dead sister's handwriting. Sandra found him in 40 minutes using databases Maggie didn't know existed. Edmund Hartley was 76 years old, living in a small house outside Savannah, Georgia. Retired, widowed, still alive. Sandra called him that afternoon with Maggie in the room. He picked up on the second ring. When Sandra explained who she was and what she was calling about, there was a silence on the line so long that Maggie thought for a moment the call had dropped. Then Edmund Hartley said, in a voice that was old and quiet and carried something Maggie recognized immediately as the specific exhaustion of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time. I wondered if this day would ever come. I turn 80 next spring. I had started to think it wouldn't. He confirmed everything. Every detail in the notebook matched his own memory precisely. He was willing to speak to an attorney. He was willing to provide testimony. He had kept his own records, he said. Boxes of them, stored in a closet he had never been able to bring himself to clear out. He would send whatever Sandra needed. Raymond Whitfield found out about the legal inquiry 11 days later. Maggie never learned exactly how. Raymond had roots in Fairbell that had grown deep over decades, and information moved toward him the way water moves toward low ground. He appeared at Sandra's office without an appointment on a Wednesday morning and was told by Sandra's assistant that Ms. Okafor did not take unscheduled meetings. He appeared at Maggie's house that same evening. Maggie saw his car from the kitchen window and opened the front door before he could knock. She stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. Raymond had not come with a smile this time. He had come with a different face, one that Maggie had seen glimpses of over the years at family gatherings when things did not go as he expected. Tight around the jaw, careful in the eyes, the face of a man who has assessed a situation and decided that controlled aggression is the appropriate tool. He said he knew what she thought she had found. He said it was ancient history, that documents from 40 years ago proved nothing in a court of law, that Edmund Hartley was a bitter old man with a decades-old grudge. He said Maggie was making a serious mistake, that she was going to spend whatever small savings she had on a legal case that would go nowhere, and that when it was over, he would still be standing, and she would have nothing. Maggie listened to all of it without expression. She had listened to frightened people make noise for 4 decades. She knew the difference between a man who was confident and a man who was afraid and performing confidence. Raymond Whitfield was afraid. When he finished, she said, "I'll tell you what I told you at the carriage house, Raymond. I'll be in touch." And she closed the door. She called Sandra that night. "File everything," she said. "We are done waiting." The filing hit the Fairbell County Court on a Monday morning in March, and by Tuesday afternoon it had traveled through every conversation in town, the way serious things travel in small places, quickly, completely, and with a crackling energy that made people stop in parking lots and lower their voices. Sandra had filed a civil fraud claim against Raymond Whitfield on behalf of Margaret Calloway and, crucially, a companion claim on behalf of Edmund Hartley, who had driven up from Savannah with 4 boxes of his own documentation and sat in Sandra's office for an entire afternoon with the quiet composure of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind so many times It no longer frightened him. The claims were detailed, specific, and extensively documented. They alleged that Raymond Whitfield had used his position on the Fairbell County Zoning Appeals Board to deliberately engineer code reclassifications targeting Edmund Hartley's properties, that he had done so through coordinated action with two county officials whose correspondence was preserved in Eleanor's envelope, and that the financial benefit Raymond had derived from the subsequent forced sale of those properties constituted the foundation of his entire real estate empire. The filing requested financial restitution for Edmund Hartley, calculated at current market value, and a full accounting of all assets derived from those original properties across 4 decades. Raymond's legal team filed a motion to dismiss within 72 hours. It was a thick, expensive document that used a great many words to make 2 arguments. First, that the events were too old to be actionable under any applicable statute of limitations. Second, that the documents Maggie had found were unverified and legally insufficient. Sandra's response was 52 pages long and addressed every argument with methodical precision. On the statute of limitations question, she cited the discovery rule, which in Georgia told the limitations period from the point at which the injured party discovered or reasonably should have discovered the fraud. Since the full extent of Raymond's actions had been concealed through shell companies and had only come to light through documents hidden in a condemned carriage house, the clock had not started running until Maggie opened that floorboard. On the question of document authenticity, Sandra had sent everything to a forensic document examiner in Atlanta. Every document was consistent with its stated date of origin. The ink, the paper, the typeface, the notarial seal on Edmund's statement, all of it verified. The judge assigned to the case was a woman named Caroline Merritt, who had been on the Fairbell bench for 18 years, and who was, according to Sandra, constitutionally allergic to people who wasted her time. She denied the motion to dismiss in language that Sandra read aloud to Maggie over the phone with barely concealed satisfaction. The court finds the claims sufficiently documented to proceed. Discovery will begin immediately. Discovery was where Raymond Whitfield's composure began to visibly fracture. His financial records going back 40 years were subpoenaed. The shell companies Eleanor had traced were now being traced again by forensic accountants with full legal authority. One of the deceased county official's daughters, a woman in her 50s who had spent her adult life slightly ashamed of her father without entirely knowing why, agreed to speak with Sandra and confirmed details of meetings that matched the documentary record precisely. The story broke publicly on a Thursday when a journalist from the Atlanta Courier published a piece under the headline, "Fairbell Developer Faces Fraud, Claims Rooted in Decades-Long Cover-Up." By that evening it had been picked up by 3 television stations. Maggie did not answer most of the calls that followed. She answered Sophie's and Daniel's and Sandra's, and she answered a call from Edmund Hartley, who had seen the coverage and wanted to say only that he was grateful, that he had stopped expecting justice a long time ago, and was still somewhat astonished to find himself receiving it. Raymond's legal team requested a settlement conference 4 weeks after the news broke. The public exposure had changed the calculation entirely. His business depended on relationships with partners, lenders, and local government contacts, and those relationships were dissolving in real time as the coverage continued. The settlement conference took place in a neutral attorney's office in Atlanta. Raymond's team made an initial offer that was, in Sandra's whispered assessment, insulting. Maggie nodded calmly. They sent back a counter. Raymond's team withdrew for 90 minutes, came back with a better number, Still not right. Another counter, another withdrawal. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon they had been sitting in that glass-walled room for 6 hours, and Raymond Whitfield, who had walked in that morning with the posture of a man who believed he still controlled the situation, was sitting across the table looking smaller than Maggie had ever seen him. The final figure settled on was $4.8 million. $3.2 million to Edmund Hartley, $1.6 million to Margaret Calloway in recognition of legal costs, the value of the documents, and what Sandra had carefully argued was Eleanor's wrongful entrapment in a marriage built on a foundation of fraud. Raymond also agreed to a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing filed with the court, something his team had resisted until the very last hour. In the end, they signed it. Maggie did not celebrate in the room. She thanked Sandra quietly, shook hands across the table with a steadiness she genuinely felt, and walked to the elevator alone. In the lobby of the building, she sat down on a bench near the entrance, and for the first time since she had opened that floorboard in the carriage house bedroom, she allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly, from a specific wordless feeling of a weight that has been carried so long you have forgotten what it felt like not to have it, finally, completely set down. The renovation of 9 Cypress Creek Lane began in May, 8 weeks after the settlement was signed. Maggie had thought carefully about what she wanted to do with the money before she spent $1 of it. She paid Sandra's fees first, generously and without negotiation, because Sandra had believed her when she had shown up in that office above a hardware store with a rusted key and a dead sister's notebook and a story that could have sounded, in less careful hands, like the wishful thinking of a grieving woman. She set aside funds for Sophie and for Daniel, enough that neither of them would ever have to make a desperate choice for the sake of money. She wrote a check to Edmund Hartley's address in Savannah that went above and beyond what the settlement had already delivered, with a note that said only, "From Eleanor." She thought he would understand. Joe Brennan was a contractor who had been working in Fairbell for 28 years and came recommended by 4 separate people who described him in identical terms: honest, thorough, and constitutionally incapable of cutting a corner. He walked through 9 Cypress Creek Lane in April and did not say it was hopeless or that she should tear it down and start fresh. He said the bones are good. Old wood holds when it has been left alone. We can work with this. They worked with it for 5 months. The sagging porch was rebuilt using wood that matched the original as closely as possible, because Maggie had decided early on that she was not interested in a renovation that erased what the building had been. She wanted it restored, not replaced. The roof was repaired, the windows reglazed, the siding replaced board by board where it had rotted, and cleaned and repainted where it had not. Inside, the pine floors were stripped back and refinished to a warm amber color that made the rooms feel lit from below. The kitchen was rebuilt entirely, and at Maggie's specific request, Joe sourced blue and white tiles that matched the originals as closely as he could find. Steady, stubborn, blue and white, the colors of something that refuses to surrender. In the bedroom where Maggie had found the hidden compartment, the iron bed frame was cleaned and returned, and in the floor, where the cavity had been, they reinstalled a small glass panel flush, with the floorboards covering the original space, which had been preserved exactly as she had found it, empty now, but intact. Beside it, fixed to the wall at eye level, was a small framed card in Maggie's own handwriting that read, "Here is where the truth was kept. Here is where the waiting ended." She moved into the carriage house in October, not because she had to. She could have kept her own house, could have bought something larger and more comfortable, but because she wanted to. Because 9 Cypress Creek Lane was where her sister had finally told the truth, and Maggie believed that places hold the energy of what happens in them. She wanted to live inside that particular energy for whatever years she had left. Sophie drove down from Charlotte the weekend Maggie moved in and stood in the restored kitchen, running her hand along the blue and white tiles with an expression that made Maggie have to look away for a moment. She said, "Mum, Aunt Ellie would have loved this." And Maggie said, "I know. I think she does." Daniel came the following weekend with his family. His 2 small children ran across the refinished floors in their socks and spent the afternoon attempting to dam the creek with stones which the creek declined to accommodate. Daniel stood on the rebuilt porch in the early evening and said quietly, "I used to wonder why you never seemed scared of anything. Now I think I understand. It isn't that you're not scared. It's that being scared doesn't stop you." Maggie thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought he was right, and she thought Eleanor had been the same way at the end. Not unafraid, but unwilling to let fear be the last word she wrote. The notebook, the sealed envelope, the rusted key left to the right person. That was not the act of someone who had given up. That was the act of someone who had decided finally that the truth deserved a future, even if she herself could not be there to see it arrive. Margaret Calloway was 63 years old when she inherited a forgotten carriage house that everyone agreed was worthless. She was 64 when she stood on its restored porch and understood what her sister had actually given her. Not money, not justice, though both had come. What Eleanor had given her was the proof that the truth, however long it waits, however deep it is buried, however many powerful people have built their comfort on top of it, does not disappear. It waits, patient and exact and entirely itself. And when the right person finally comes with the right key and the willingness to look, it surfaces every single time. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever been handed the broken piece, the forgotten thing, the inheritance that made the room laugh, then you already understand what Margaret Calloway understood standing in that overgrown driveway, that what looks like nothing is sometimes everything. That the people who underestimate you are counting on you to agree with them, and that the truth your loved ones carried, however quietly, however long, is never truly lost as long as someone who loves them is still willing to look. Leave one word in the comments that describes what you would do if you were handed a key to something everyone else had already dismissed. Share this story with someone who is carrying something heavy right now, someone who needs to remember that silence is not the same as surrender, and that sometimes the people who love us most leave us exactly what we need hidden exactly where we will find it when we are ready. Because dreams don't age and neither does the truth. Welcome to our family of resilient souls. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. See you in the next story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.